Let's hear from the Shadow Minister for Cyber Security, James Paterson, who joins me live from Melbourne. First, I'll play part of what Paul Keating said today.
They got right knocking Hughes off over conscription. Curtin got it right in knocking Churchill off over the troops from Burma back to Papua New Guinea, back to Kokoda. Arthur Corwell got it right when he opposed the Vietnam War. Simon Crean got it right when he said we shouldn't be sending troops to Iraq. But this one is where we break the winning streak. The two principal people on the left in Australia are now Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong. And of course they would say, the old left, oh, that mob in Sussex Street, you can't trust them. But God, if you look at me or Laurie Bretton or Leo McClay, we look like Bolsheviks compared to them. Bolsheviks.
Well, Anthony Attila Albanese to Paul Keating, James Paterson. What did you make of all that?
Good afternoon, Andrew. Well, even by Paul Keating standards, this was an utterly extraordinary performance at the National Press Club today, an unhinged spray at his friends and former colleagues in the Labor Party and the government, an attack on our closest allies and friends, the United States, the United Kingdom, but also India. Previously, he's attacked Japan. In fact, there's only one country in the world that he appears unwilling or unable to criticise, and that's China. When Mr Keating's made contributions like this in the past, Anthony Albanese has often dismissed them by saying Mr Keating's entitled to his views, like he is just some random person in the street, and perhaps they might send out an assistant minister or a backbencher to more comprehensively respond. I think this demands a much more serious response. Paul Keating is not just a random person in the street. He's not just a former Labor Prime Minister, but a Labor Party legend, admired by many of the current Labor MPs, senators and ministers. And this demands a senior response, a response from the Prime Minister, from the Foreign Minister, from the Defence Minister, comprehensively setting out how they depart from his thinking. Okay. Otherwise, people will be thinking that there is some sympathy for these thoughts. All
right, well, hang on. Malcolm Fraser used to bag John Howard. I don't remember John Howard coming out against Malcolm Fraser at the time.
I think the last thing that anyone would criticise the Liberal Party of doing is being too respectful of Malcolm Fraser's legacy. I think, in fact, Malcolm Fraser and his supporters have the opposite view, that we were, in fact, too critical of his views in his post-parliamentary life. We set out very clearly the ways in which we disagreed with him. We were unashamed of doing so. And if one of our living former legends, like John Howard, came out and made some unhinged comments like this, I can assure you we would be out there very clearly explaining how we disagree. Thankfully, John Howard doesn't behave like that. Our current living former Prime Ministers don't behave like that, but Paul Keating does, and he hasn't been called out by the senior levels of the Labor Party, and now is the time they must call him out.
What's inspiring him, do you think, Paul Keating?
I don't want to speculate about his state of mind or about his motivations, only he can speak to that. I think it was very telling, though, when the journalist from the Sydney Morning Herald, Matthew Knott, put to him an opportunity multiple times to criticise the Chinese government for their treatment of Uyghurs, and he refused to take up that opportunity multiple times, and then went on to say that the treatment of Uyghurs is somehow in dispute. It is not in dispute. The United Nations has said this may constitute crimes against humanity. Human rights groups have said this might constitute genocide. There is ample evidence on the public record that we know that millions of Uyghurs have been interned against their will, that their culture has been subjugated and destroyed by the Chinese government, that they are being persecuted in one of the worst human rights abuses that we've seen in the 21st century. So for him being unwilling to call that out, and in fact to call that into question, is a very dark stain on his public reputation.
All right, well, that was Paul Keating. This was Kevin Rudd with SBS French talking about AUKUS 2 years ago. Have a listen.
What is the reason for the deception? I don't understand it. Was it to simply produce a grand surprise for Australian domestic politics that we were now going to enter the big league with nuclear-powered submarines in partnership with the British and the Americans? I suspect there is a domestic political agenda at play, which is for Morrison to make himself look big, important, and hairy-chested. I am concerned about the long-term impact that has on Australian sovereignty on our own naval forces, because there are times when we will disagree with the United States. So as an ally of the United States, you don't necessarily end up agreeing with the Americans on every element of strategy. Sometimes our American friends get it wrong.
Sometimes our American friends get it wrong. OK, that was 2 years ago. Is this the best appointment Anthony Albanese could have made as Australian ambassador to the US, James Paterson?
Kevin Rudd is clearly in a very different category to Paul Keating. I wouldn't suggest that they're in the same ballpark at all, but you are right to draw attention to those comments because neither Mr Rudd nor the Prime Minister nor the Foreign Minister who have appointed him to be our ambassador in Washington DC have explained whether or not Kevin Rudd has changed his view about these issues. And in the Australian government, there will be few people more important than our ambassador to Washington DC in the successful implementation of AUKUS. He will be in many meetings that will be pivotal to making sure it succeeds. Now, I assume he probably has changed his mind. I assume perhaps he was over-egging his criticism for domestic or partisan intent. But actually, it's incumbent on him and those who appointed him to come out and explain that and to reassure the Australian people that he is fully supportive of the implementation of AUKUS and that he will fulfil his responsibilities as ambassador to do so.
All right, well, interesting you say that. Arthur Sinodina said earlier in this program, the outgoing ambassador, a former colleague of yours, that there wouldn't be a cigarette paper between the government's position on AUKUS and that of Kevin Rudd going forward.
Well, I hope that Arthur's right. And Arthur mentioned in that interview with you that he's met with Kevin Rudd more recently, and maybe Kevin has made that point to him directly. But he hasn't made that point publicly. He hasn't reassured the Australian people that he has changed his mind from 2 years ago. Because let's remember, Kevin Rudd wasn't just critical of the announcement of AUKUS. He wasn't just critical of the handling of the French relationship, for example. He was actually critical of the substance of it. He said it could compromise Australia's sovereignty. That's a very fundamental critique of AUKUS. And if he still believes that, he's not an appropriate appointment for that role. And if he doesn't still believe that, then it's incumbent on him to say so, or for the Prime Minister or Penny Wong to clarify, but none of them have done so far.
Well, finally, I wanted to ask you about the cost of AUKUS, and Bill Shorten was on earlier with Simon Love saying hands off the NDIS. NDIS savings shouldn't pay for defence. What do you make of that?
Well, no one is suggesting that NDIS savings should pay for defence. AUKUS is going to be a very expensive investment, but a necessary and worthy one, and it will have to be paid for. And the government will have to make some tough decisions about how to accommodate this spending. And so far, they've shown absolutely no willingness at all to say no to any of their core constituencies when they come to them to ask for money. They say yes to increased funding to the NDIS, to aged care, to healthcare, to childcare.
Doesn't Peter Dutton say, yes, you can save with the NDIS? And doesn't that kind of link to the defence spend then?
No, I think that's been misinterpreted. In his interview with Sarah Ferguson on 7:30 the other night, he was asked whether he'd be constructive about identifying savings. He pointed to his budget reply speech where he offered bipartisan support to the Labor Party to get the spending pressures in the NDIS under control. He wasn't saying that that was an area that we could cut to pay for defence. He was using that as an example of how we have been constructive and bipartisan to help the government find savings. Of course, if the government believes there are savings that need to be made in the defence portfolio or anywhere else, we're very open-minded to hear their case as to how that can be made. But so far, this government has identified virtually no savings at all, and they've said yes to everyone who comes to them asking for money. And this is going to require tough choices, and it is not clear that this government is willing to make those tough choices. We'll get a sense of that in the budget in May, but the jury is still out.
James Paterson, I have a slight feeling that I've just seen some hairs be split, but that's fine. Thanks very much for your time this afternoon.
Thanks, Andrew.